Hello, everyone. Just as a quick introduction, my name is Jessica Denise Dixon. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a Black woman, descended on both sides of my family from the enslaved. Um, those are important things for me to share because it very much shapes how I move through the world, how I see the world, and the work that I do in the world. I am a consultant with Rise San Diego and was in their 6th leadership cohort as a fellow. I run my own coaching and consulting business. And that business is really about people being able to face the wholeness of their humanity and the truth of who we are made to be outside of the structures of white supremacy and patriarchy and capitalism that require that we make ourselves small or fit into kind of a neat box. So I support organizations in creating cultures where people can feel safe, people can be safe and have their full self-expression. And so I'm super happy to be with you here today. We're going to talk about community-led decisions. And before we even get into that, there's a lot of groundwork that we're going to set around what it actually requires for those things to thrive. But I always like to start with some kind of presence practice. And that is something that gets us in here in the moment, in our bodies. Um, you know, maybe you had a slow morning, or maybe you're actually just bringing a lot into the space. Everything that you are bringing, everything that you are is very much welcome in this space. And I am grateful that you are here. I'm honored to be here with you. So just for a few moments, you can keep your camera off or you can have it on, it's up to you. But I would just love it if you softened your eye gaze or closed your eyes, feeling the weight of your body in your chair, or maybe you're home in bed and decided to tune in from there. Just feeling your weight kind of sink in. If you have a chair that has a back, allowing yourself to just kind of lean in, feeling the support that is there. And just taking a moment to be, noticing the smells that linger in the air, the sounds of your environment, what you can taste on your tongue. Maybe you're drinking coffee or tea. Or maybe you're watching the replay after hours. It's 5 o'clock somewhere. You're drinking wine. Just being with what you notice. Maybe even putting your hands on your chair or on your body and just noticing the texture of your skin, the texture of the clothes that you're wearing. Noticing where the breath goes as you breathe. As you breathe naturally, maybe it goes a little bit into your chest, maybe stays at the top, maybe you're breathing down into your belly. Noticing what feelings you're present to. Maybe you're bringing frustration or excitement into the room. Maybe there's a sense of calm. And just also noticing the thoughts. Our thoughts can sometimes zigzag and go to and fro, wanting to move on. Sometimes slowing down and just being present is something that our mind is not used to. So it comes up with all the thoughts about what we could be doing, what's happening next, or even what we've done. So we get a chance to just allow Allow those to be present and come back into the moment. We want to start to just breathe a little bit more deeply into the pelvic floor, down through the belly, into those sit bones. Letting yourself exhale. And noticing even as you breathe in and out, whether that is something that's comfortable for you. It's often easier for me to breathe in and hold, like I'm holding the weight of the world. It's a little bit harder for me to let go. You may notice that it feels easier for you to let go, and you're having some challenges actually taking in a deep breath. When we're present, we just notice without judgment. It's just information, it's data. And the more present we are with ourselves, with our own experience, it gives us more access to be present with one another, to be present within our community. And we practice presence with the breath. We practice taking in. We practice letting go. As we take in the air, our body processes what we need, and we release that which we no longer need, but would be nourishing for the environment and the plants and the sea and the air. Sometimes I'm struck by how just being present is a contribution. And we don't have to do, just our being. As we exhale, we contribute to life. And this sets the stage for what we'll speak about today. So why don't we wrap this time up with 3 nice deep breaths. And coming back to the space, maybe you want to give yourself a little hug or a shoulder roll or a stretch. Ooh, my back cracking feels good. So I like to start our time with a little icebreaker. And the icebreaker today is, if you were to write a memoir, what would its title be? And I would love for you to just put that in the chat here. I will put the question in the chat. Ooh, maybe. If you were to write a memoir, what would its title be? Yeah, that happened. Or yep, that happened. Okay. I love that. I'm tired. Amen. Too much and never enough. Ooh, I feel that. Plot twist. Oh, of course. I was just listening to Rent last night. Seasons of Love is a wonderful, wonderful musical. It's amazing that I still remember all the words from the original Broadway cast version. It just comes back, even though I haven't listened to it in a while. Brat. Oh, yeah. She hung out in the vampire corner of the internet. Julie Kodama, sorry, I'm Asian. Life is experience. What a joy if you let it be. I did. What were you thinking? Hope I have the right inflection on some of these, you know. It's hard to, it can be hard to read tone. Mine would be life on vulnerability, which is also the name of a community that I run. Um, but that has been my journey, is to actually embrace life on vulnerability fully. The longest hallway. The best is yet to come. Ashe. I love these. I love these. So keep sharing. I'm gonna get started on the presentation because I know an hour and a half goes by very, very quickly. And I want some time for us to be able to process. So today we're talking about community-led decisions, and we're gonna actually lead the conversation by looking at a few things: hierarchy, safety, and empathy. And so I want to start by talking about safety. And the idea of safety can sometimes feel overwhelming. We don't often know what safety actually is. Sometimes we know that we don't feel safe, even if we don't have the language. But sometimes when we don't feel safe, it can look like anxiety. It can look like anger. Not being or feeling safe can look like hypervigilance. It can look like aggression. It can look like shutting down. It can look like a few things. And what I want to do is start giving us the language to the embodied experience, because our sense of safety is not an intellectual thing. And in order to make community-led decisions, we actually have to know what safety is to create it so that people feel safe, like they can contribute. And I think it's helpful to think of safety as a context, not like one thing, but a context that we have accountability for creating for one another, and specifically within an organization for people whose positions are higher up, who have positional hierarchy, to intentionally be responsible and accountable for creating for the people who they supervise or manage. And so safety is a sense of protection. It's a state of being uninjured. It's of being free from harm or danger. And of course, that is the ideal. So we have the ideal of what safety is, and then we, humans come in. Humans come in. So we may strive to a sense of perfection, maybe because we're an Enneagram 1, or maybe we've been like conditioned to like aim for perfection because of the construct of white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, those kinds of things. But perfection is often like this moving target that we can never actually achieve. And so when we become much more realistic when we realize that perfectionism is not a character trait. And when we realize this, we can, start to look at things like excellence, like completeness, which is actually the original definition of perfection, where being flawless actually came later. I say all that because it's important to understand that as humans, we're going to make mistakes. We're going to accidentally wound someone. By our nature, to be our own individual is to be different, which is kind of inherently conflictual. And that's not a bad thing, because it's natural that we are relating to one another from a different position. It's not a bad thing. Conflicts may arise, will arise. We're going to make a mistake. Even with the best of intentions, we're going to hurt someone, which is why safety isn't this one-time thing. It's a context. Now, when we don't feel safe, we have reactivity in our nervous systems. And even if we don't know how to name that or know that's what it is, sometimes we may be so disembodied or so disconnected from our body or intellectual that we don't necessarily feel our nervous systems reacting. And so sometimes these responses or this reactivity can come out emotionally or intellectually. So we're going to talk quickly about the reactions that we can have. And I'm going to talk about fight, flight, freeze, appease, and collapse. And fight is just as it sounds. People get aggressive, the body gets jacked up and ready to kick some, you know what? Fight can show up physically. It can also mean aggression in a conversation, yelling, being really defensive. If you've ever been in a fight with someone or a conversation and they increase their body size, so someone was intimidated, this can be part of a fight response. Even if it's just, I'm going to intimidate you so you back down. I've had some times in my past, God's working on me, where I have like cussed someone all the way out and just like blacked out. For me, like that was a fight response. Like, I'm just gonna tell you everything about yourself. Now, thankfully, I don't do that as much anymore. But all the chemicals, they're pumping within us, and our defense often, becomes offense, and this is a fight response. Now, this can show up intellectually in people who want to argue or push back on any and everything. I have known many people like this. And it can show up in people who want to like contradict things without adding anything helpful, right? People who want to give you feedback on something, but it's only critique and there's nothing that's actually constructive about it. This often is a fight response, and it functions, as a nervous system protection. The next one is flight or flee. So in this response, our nervous system also gets jacked up, but instead of fighting, we leave. We get out of the situation. So this can mean physically leaving or physically running away, but it can also show up and shutting down important conversations, or going silent, checking out, not responding to an email because we're like avoiding it, right? The chemicals are still pumping, but there's no progress because the person emotionally, energetically, or physically takes themselves out of the space. And so it can feel like this aggressive shutdown. The next is freeze. And like fight or flight, the body kind of gets jacked up and ready to react. But instead of doing either of those things, there's panic. So the body freezes. The body wants to do something, but doesn't see that fighting or running or fleeing would be the best outcome to actually protect you. So some people talk about it as an out-of-body experience. Sometimes the body goes rigid. Sometimes there's a sense of exhaustion or indecision. This can feel like a deer in the headlights situation, because the body does want to respond. So the energy is there, but it gets drained trying to figure out what to do. Depending on how powerless the person feels in the situation, the body may awaken and run or fight, or it may stay in freeze, or it may actually reject that and go into a more parasympathetic reaction. If you've ever been tongue-tied during a meeting, this might be this freeze response, or something said something that kind of incensed you, or like it was infuriating, or it was just patently false, and you disagree, but you're not sure if it's actually okay for you to have a dissenting opinion. So it's like you want to say something, but maybe the person has power over you and you don't feel safe doing that. So instead, I call it shorting out. This is when I like short out. My brain is like, has all these thoughts running and it just doesn't know what to do. So it's like, I just kind of stop thinking. Like my brain kind of turns off. The appease response is part of a sympathetic response, and the body shuts down a bit. So this and the next collapse, they tend to happen the more powerless we feel. And now this isn't an intellectual thing. This is happening in our nervous system. It can show up intellectually, but this is like our body's experience. Now, appease is also called fawning or people pleasing or submitting. And this includes things like automatically saying yes when you want to say no. It includes things like flattering people or agreeing with something that you don't actually agree with. This is a way of going along to get along. And this might be like, you might see this in like the yes person, where like you're in a meeting and this one person's like agreeing and you're like, this is clearly wrong. Like, this is not, why are you agreeing with this? This might be what they're experiencing. It's like a way of deferring your own sense of self so you won't be seen as a challenge. So you won't be, yes, creating a culture of niceness. So you won't be seen as a challenge. So you won't be seen as creating problems. So you're doing what you can to reduce any kind of imminent threat and minimize more emotional, psychological, spiritual, or even physical violence. People who utilize the appease response are often feel ashamed because they didn't do what they knew they should do. And while this too can feel like an out-of-body experience where you're watching yourself perform, it's important to always remember that the nervous system is trying to protect you and has decided that this is the best course of action for your safety. And sometimes when our nervous system is activated, it will default to the culture of whiteness. And so I highly recommend, if you have not watched that workshop, that you go back and you understand what that looks like and how that shows up. Because when you feel unsafe, we're much more likely to default to that to try to assuage what's happening. And when I'm talking about safety, I mean like not just necessarily physical safety, but like feeling like I can be who I really am in this position. Like I can be fully me. You know, maybe it's unsafe. Maybe you have a lot of questions, but it feels unsafe to be the person who asks, because then you're seen as the one who's trying to stir up something. So you maybe default to appease, even things that are worth questioning. So this can be a common response for people whose identities are marginalized. And it's a common response when there is hierarchy and you are not the person who holds the power within the hierarchy. It can be a passive resignation trauma response that comes from not knowing it's safe for you because you do not have the positional power or the hierarchical power or societal power, privilege. So you have to minimize yourself to survive. Now the collapse response is like the body shuts down, muscles relax, the heart rate decreases. The person may not be able to speak at all. There might be feigning, passing out, like letting go of bowels. The body can feel really weak or tremble. This is also called a flop response. Now, my hope is that you're not having those kinds of environments where you feel so unsafe that that is your only recourse. But I do know people who have been so traumatized that that is all that's left for them as far as a response. So we obviously don't want to create any situation in which these are the prevalent responses within our organizations. We don't want that. Because when these are present, there's an absence of a sense of safety. And so, and I spend so much time talking about appease because it's so common. It's often not spoken about within the trauma responses, but it's so common. And you can think people are just being really nice to each other, but people are actually kind of in this shutdown response because they don't feel like they can be fully communicative about their experience. They don't feel like they can be really whole in their environment. So one thing that's important for me to say is that our trauma responses, everything that we spoke about, they're all for our survival and they're all adaptive in their own ways. They're all attempts at keeping us safe. Now, there's two things about this. One is a trauma response might be inappropriate for what's happening. But if the body senses that there's some lack of safety, then we have to check in with ourselves around that. Because our responses can lack context around time. Like it's not happening right now. It happened in the past, but it's not happening right now. Around severity, it's preventing the worst case scenario and situation. So the situation might feel like something that's happened before, but it's not necessarily actually truly happening. So we get to then soothe ourselves and we get to do the work to develop like the self-reflection so that we're not in a trauma response. If they're triggering something from the past, that's important. So we don't overstep them. We explore where they're coming from so we don't lose ourselves in them anymore. I'm just looking at the chat, reminding me of the discourse around quiet quitting, people feeling burned out, disinterested in their role. So why participate or ask questions? Decisions are made for them without them instead of that. Yes, instead of with them. This is it. This is like, I don't feel like I have power. So this is the way. This is the way forward. And sometimes, again, this can feel like peace or niceness within your organization. So as a leader, you know, you have an opportunity to really look at what's really happening. Because that's the second point around this. As leaders, you have to be responsible for recognizing part of our leadership, part of my leadership, part of your leadership is being responsible for recognizing if someone is in a trauma response. And then actually to explore what the disconnect is and explore where safety may be lacking. It may be lacking because you don't have the emotional intelligence that they need to feel safe. So you're talking about something and you feel blown off. And then, you know, you're talking to your supervisor and they don't know how to handle it. That could be, you know, that's just one example of that. As a leader, it's important to be able to create an atmosphere and context of safety so people can stay present and are not constantly on the defense. Now, part of the context of safety is a few things that I want to cover. And I've covered some of these more in depth in a previous workshop, okay? So one is boundaries. Boundaries are actually needed for us to have healthy flourishing. We set boundaries so that we can remain in healthy relationship to one another. Boundaries are not fortresses to keep people out, and they're not punishments. Boundaries say, I want to be related to you in a healthy way, and these are the things that I need for that to happen. Can you agree to that? Now, to be able to set them in a work setting is going to take an intentional dismantling of whiteness culture about ideas and ideals of professionalism. People need to be able to set healthy boundaries in order to feel safe. You know, I know that there's like a culture of like a good, like some places have a good morning culture where like you come in and you say good morning. And if you're not a morning person and you would rather maybe have 20 minutes to get settled in before you speak to another person, you can be judged as not being a team player, all these things, or people can uphold that boundary and say, oh, this is actually what this person needs to be able to relate to us in a healthy and positive way. And so it's important for us to actually look at what is allowed within our organizations. Another aspect in the context of safety is consent, which means that you check in with the person and you have a practice of waiting for a yes before proceeding. Now, if we had more time, we'd go into more around, you know, there's like explicit and implicit, but it's all really based around a mutual understanding. Within a consensual atmosphere or environment, there's not a no or a penalty. There's not a penalty for a no. And there's not a demand or a manipulation to get to a yes. So this actually makes our communication that much more important because we have to be able to ask questions. If we ask a yes or no question, there has to be space for a no. Or we have to actually get better at asking questions. Consensual culture creates safety because they're not based on assumptions. They're intentional and based on intentional communication. It also means that hierarchy and power over does not mean lording over someone. It doesn't mean like I can just like take over your calendar anytime I want because I'm your supervisor, right? It gives people the chance to show up in their most authentic way because it says like, I'm going to check in with you and see what's best for you. And it's not a deferral of oneself. Mutual consent is what we want, where I can say yes and you can say yes. And we can actually talk through and negotiate and navigate the no's. So boundaries and consent allow people to actually trust their own autonomy and agency and trust themselves to set their own limits. So it's important. Another part of this context of safety is an ethic of repairing harm, right? Intentionally repairing harm, not the sorry I hurt you or sorry you felt that way, which is not a real apology, by the way. If you do harm, you actively choose repair by understanding the impact by making restitution, by making a promise and committing to it. And part of that commitment is reflecting on what allowed that harm to happen. It might mean that you were unintentionally or unconsciously wielding privilege and that hurt someone, or you were using power over to get something that you wanted and someone was hurt. So, part of that is actually you being self-aware and self-reflective. Now, this also means valuing impact over intention. Like, here you understand that even with the best of intentions, sometimes the impact is not what you imagined it would be. When we value the outcome, when we value, oh, this is what happened here, this was the impact, this was positive or negative, then we get to actually hone in on our intention. We get to redefine our intention to both include the positive that we hope to do, but also including the harm that we want to avoid. And then we, integrate more additional planning to ensure that harm does not happen. We don't double down on our intention. We own where our intention did not land, and we examine why. We examine what happened. When we examine what could be better in the next time. Now, another thing in the context of safety is vulnerability versus transparency. And I see this is easily conflated. Transparency is an openness about the facts of a situation. I'm sharing information. I'm being transparent about this is a salary. This is a situation that happened. These are the facts. I'm laying them out. That's transparent. Now, vulnerability is the capacity, the ability to actually speak about the impact of something, to be able to talk about how you feel about something, how it impacts you and others. Now, the most important thing is that you're able to distinguish between them and that you don't play or like feign vulnerability or act like you were speaking vulnerable when it's really actually just transparency. I see this a lot in organizations, and it can actually be like an unintentional form of gaslighting. There are going to be times when being transparent is about all you can give. There's going to be times when it's actually the most appropriate thing because you can't share vulnerably about what's happening, either because it's fresh, because there are people above you who are going to have a problem with that, and you know that it's going to impact you. But you have to be aware of it, and you have to move forward with that awareness and with that reflection. Because when you pretend like you're being vulnerable when you're just being transparent, that's another thing that can lead to harm. Okay. Now this is going to impact your leadership, and it's especially going to impact conversation about community-led decisions. So I want to hear some thoughts in the chat about why you think I kind of started talking about safety. Like, why is that important? What are your thoughts? What are you noticing? I'd love to hear some thoughts in the chat. It's important to feel like you can speak openly and make mistakes. Trust building. Yep. Yes. What else, friends? I think we forget that safety is a core need and influences everyone's reactions and decision making. Yeah. Oh, the prompt is like, well, why would I have started this conversation talking about the context of safety? Yeah, that's the prompt. Yeah. Safety is a core need. It is driving us consciously and unconsciously in every single thing we do. Yeah. Without a safe space where people can share their thoughts, leaders will never know what is truly happening with their staff or within the organization. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. I think it also helps explain some decisions, those made out of a fear, appeasement, etc. Yes. Without safety, it's hard to have an honest meeting or discussion. Yeah. It drives both conscious and unconscious behavior. After an HR issue at a certain position, I realized I could get 8 hours of sleep again. Oof. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Thank you all. I love this. I love this. I love this. Safety opens up the space to learn both on the employee and management level. Yes. It drives connection, mentorship, and positive change. Amen. Thank you all for sharing. You can continue to put it in the chat. I'm just going to keep going, right? Because yes, in decisions where people in the community or an organization are involved, it's harder when the leader has no context for what safety is. And the people within the organization or in the community have no sense that their leaders care about their safety. Remembering that safety isn't just life or death, it's psychological, it's emotional. It's, can I say this and be heard, or will I be dismissed? Will I be cast aside? Will I be at risk of losing my job? If I disagree with someone in power, could they use their power to take something from me? Decision-making can be complex. And sometimes, again, the priority will be transparency and only sharing small aspects. But if people don't feel safe and you withhold information, that, or if people don't feel safe, it's going to feel like you're withholding. Because if you are not creating a context of safety, then that often leaves gaps in your communication. So let's talk about community-led decisions. And now there's not one definition, so we're going to talk about approaching this in a few ways. Now, one form of community-led decisions is that the community actually comes up with the vision and they implement it completely. They're in charge of the decisions, they're in charge of the resources because they're coming up with solutions and are given the resources to implement them. It tends to be effective and efficient. Leadership arises within the community, and this is founded upon relationships based on trust and respect. It takes energy and capacity within the community to implement, which again means actually having the resources. You know, sometimes we don't always think of financial capital, for example, like being such an important resource, but when we have money, sometimes having financial capital gives us more time because we don't have to do the other thing that we were doing to create more money. And so these resources matter. Now, I also want to say that this matters when you're doing work within the community, but also community-led decisions, it matters within the organization. So if you think about people like VP director level kind of being an organization, and when I say that, or in the leadership, and then people who work or volunteer and you know, clients or consumers as the community. So that could be a helpful way for us to look at this. Another form is when community members and organizations collaborate. Now, within an organization, this might mean people who have hierarchical decision-making power collaborate with people at levels who don't have the same power. There's a sharing of resources. This relies on social capital. So like how we are related to one another shapes this in big ways. it can take a little bit longer to reach consensus, right? Because most organizations have a specific mission and goal, and that might not overlay perfectly with the desires of a community. So here it's really important to develop a shared vision. And I think this is even true within organizations where people who are maybe like at the CEO, VP level don't always even have the same vision as the people who are running the day-to-day. They have different priorities sometimes. And that's why this open communication, creating safety and creating a space where people can share that becomes that much more important. Another form of this is where the community makes decisions within the parameters that an organization or the people in power have set. There are some shared goals, but the organization says, like, this is what we're working toward, and here's where we need to focus on your input on your decisions. So this is often what's used when there's like a program or service that the organization wants to offer. This is often more short-term, project-based, initiative-based. So if it's not paired with other long-term things, then it's actually important to actually look at what else is needed within the community. This form invites people to share their lived experiences as part of the solution making and help develop them. And then the last to talk about is when the organization decides what changes are going to be made within the community and consults the community for maybe how best to implement them or maybe even what needs to happen. So the organization holds the power. They may use focus groups to get perspective or input. There's not necessarily full alignment with the community's needs and desires and the organization, but the agenda here is organization driven. So it's, I have an agenda, I'm going to do this in the community, and I'd love to hear how this is going to land or how to best implement that. So we see kind of a continuum or a spectrum of community driven versus community consultant. So we see these kind of 4 different ways that we can look at it. And they can apply again to the work within the organization as well as within the community. So what makes the most sense for your organization might depend on how the hierarchy lives, as well as what your desires are and your values. Now, what I want to say is that hierarchy isn't inherently bad. It's not an inherently bad thing. There's like inherently not a negative connotation. It can be a place where we lead with love and care for others. It could be a place when we take on this role where we have more responsibility so that people under us don't have to worry about politics, that the people under us don't have to worry about other things that might take them away from what's important and what's crucial to them. And it can be a place where power is hoarded. And it can be a place where power is lorded over others. So we have to be able to look at how is the hierarchy showing up in our organization? Is it showing up in the way that is like, I empower you to do the important work and I'm going to take care of this other stuff that I don't want you to worry about? Or is it like, I get to make the decisions and maybe I'll kind of listen to you, or sometimes, you know, if we're wanting, you know, community driven, community led versus community consulted decisions, hierarchy cannot be power over. It has to be a power with. That means that you own your power fully, I own my power fully. There's a sharing of resources. You know, it's the people in power say, like, these are the resources that I have, these are the finances, these are the connections in the community. These are the people you need to know. This is the time. This is the product or the resources that, you know, the tangible things that are going to help you. And it often means that we want to look at gatekeeping within the decision making, right? Often with hierarchy, that is power over. There's a lot of gatekeeping, which often comes with a lack of communication. Often the communication is focused on protecting people at the top or assuaging them rather than being with the people. And so power dynamics become crucial to be able to examine and really look at honestly, who is driving the processes? Are they stakeholders who are maybe disconnected from the lived experiences within a community or within an organization? Are they, people often, when I was working in higher education, people always said that they wanted a promotion. And I would always say, are you sure? Because once you start to move up, there's a more natural disconnect from the people that you're immediately serving in your role. And so we have like a client, customer, consumer. And when we move up, we get less interaction with them. And that changes the dynamic. So it's always important to say, like, what do we really want from our experience? And how, when we move up, maybe we move up in the organization, how can I actually be really related to what's going on at those levels that I've moved from? And that, like, making sure that that is an integral part of your leadership can make a difference. It's going to take humility and patience, and the ability to listen well. Empathy, right? It's this condition of stepping into the world of another person. You don't just like feel bad for someone or pity them or feel like, oh, that kind of sucks. Like, empathy is like this embodied experience. Like, I have a sense of your world and I am right here with you. Now, this takes an intentional focus on developing emotional intelligence. Because empathy is an intentional decision to be with one another in the fullness of their experience. And it means also like not prioritizing your own experience. Empathizing isn't just the, oh, I've faced this before, so listen to me and let me center myself. It's like, oh, I can tap into that place where I've experienced this. Let me be more with you. So this is especially important if you have positional or societal power, because often these positionalities stop people from being able to be present to what others are experiencing. So it takes intentionality to center their perspectives of the people who you may hold power over, either because of your privilege or because of your position. And ultimately, community-led approaches mean that you don't do surveys and get people's perspectives and not even acknowledge the results or actively address what is there. Part of what we want to do is be leaders who are in integrity. So we want to ask questions and get feedback around what would shape our organizations to actually be places where there is a felt sense of safety, there's a context of safety, and where people can flourish. Doing surveys and not implementing or looking, or really like taking a fine-tooth comb and looking and being able to see, okay, we can't do this now, but maybe we can do it later, or coming up with a long-term plan. When we don't do things like that, that's what we call performative behavior. And how do we know something is performative? Often, we can tell something is performative if we're doing it to look or be perceived in a certain way. Like, me and my friend just finished running a program, and I kind of joked, like, do we want to send out a survey about how people experience the program? And it's like, I don't usually, because like I kind of don't care what they have to say. Like, and I don't mean that in like a bad way, but it's like, realistically, am I going to take this feedback? There might be something helpful in it, but I trust my expertise and I trust the process that they went through, because I have the feedback of how their lives are changed right in front of me. So it would be very performative for me if I sent out a survey and did not care, didn't look at it, or looked at it just to like put out a report. Like, that's very performative. Another way you can tell something is performative if there's no direct impact on the people we claim to be working for or supporting. I think of the Black squares in 2020 on Instagram. which I won't get into too much, but this is still triggering to me. It was supposed to be this blackout that centers the voices of Black women. So people posted a black square instead of like whatever their regular posting would be. But what it actually did was create more noise in the digital atmosphere. What it actually did was silence the voices of Black educators, advocates, and creators. So adding a black square was in intention was equated with I'm creating space. But in reality, it ended up centering white people because of the space that they took up. So we always want to be intentional about making sure that we're not just performing, right? That we're listening to people and having conversations about the things that are happening in the survey results or the polls. Never ask questions in a survey that you won't change. That is a great rule to have. And I think it's beautiful and it's in integrity. You know, as leaders, we want to really look at where are the gaps in our integrity? What is shaping the gaps in our integrity? And how can we shore those up? You know, as we're looking at things like, you know, community-led decisions and not being performative, we want to look at making sure that we listen, making sure that we set aside resources for the things that the community cares about, that we aspire to support the community with what they seek rather than just putting our agenda on them. We want to always be learning and checking in around the impact instead of just trusting that our good intention was enough. We want to ensure that there's intentional inclusion of those who are closest to the pain and have the lived experience within the community or within the role. We want to make sure that the skills, the strengths, and the resilience of the people within the community are utilized and not downplayed. These are important because, you know, as we're thinking about what it means to make community-led decisions, or, you know, maybe it's more community consulted is what we actually have honest capacity for and not like community driven. We want to be able to move forward with integrity with those. And I think that being able to look at what are the gaps? What are the gaps here? What's missing here? That would actually, the presence of which would bring flourishing and would bring a sense of safety, would bring a sense that people can really like do the work and make change. So I think now is a good time to open up for questions and reflections. What are you all seeing? What do you have questions about? You can unmute yourself too. I know that Kristen's going to stop the recording. Oh yeah, for those in entry level or junior roles at an organization, how can they push for community-led decisions? Yes. Well, I think that what becomes really important is how can you talk to your supervisor? Like, do you feel like you can? So the sense of safety is something that your supervisor is responsible for cultivating and curating, or the people who are managing you. And you have a responsibility to use your voice to source your own sense of safety and your own sense of empowerment so that you can actually talk about what is really needed. And I think that during supervision, if that's something that is part of your work, that you have really honest conversations about what is missing. And, you know, supervisors, I think it's even important for you to be able to have honest conversations about what can or cannot be done. Like so much frustration comes from a promise or like a hopefulness because supervisors, people who are managing, aren't actually being really honest about what can or cannot be done, or what's more of a long-term thing versus short-term thing. So I think it's important for you to use your voice, but also And I hate to say this, the reality is that if you're brushed off and you're not listened to, it might not be the right place for you. Like, you might want to also look and see, where are some places where I can actually bring my voice and be heard? You know, especially if you have, you know, an identity that has been historically and systemically marginalized. Your voice has been silenced for a long time. And if you're not in a place that's going to listen, that's going to hear, that's going to heed and honor and value, it might be time to look somewhere else. And I really do. I hate saying that, but it also is true. It also is true. You want to find your sense of empowerment. And I also know that if people in leadership positions are not doing their own work to dismantle their own bias, that people of color and people with marginalized identities tend to get the brunt of retaliation for speaking up. So it feels like a dance. You know, if your organization actually is moving toward health, then hopefully there's more of an openness, and, you know, being present to how they react and respond when you give feedback is going to be an important thing for you moving forward. So that's my initial thought. So my final thought is that if you say that you are committed to community-led approaches and you're not actively cultivating this context of safety, if you're not actively eliminating the barriers to hierarchy and these power over dynamics, if you're not actively developing your emotional intelligence that allows for more authentic, sincere communication, it's going to be hard to do that. So I want you to be encouraged that because you are here, you're on the right track. The next step is to look, what are the gaps within my organization? What is the work that I need to do as a leader to ensure that people can have a sense of safety, that they're not stuck appeasing me because I have been unaware of how I wield my power? You know, you want to assess, what are my communication skills? Is there authenticity in how I communicate and in how I show up? There's a workbook for you that's going to help you honestly kind of just look at what you need and hopefully give you the courage to do what you need to do to move forward. So I think that's all I have to say. Thank you for tuning in. And my one reminder is always do the work. Don't just talk about it, be about it.